This going to walk you guys through Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants. This is something I normally have. It's just a Prezi that you can read, but I'm having some issues with Prezi, so I'm going to make a video out of it. This is one of my absolute favorite short stories. A lot of people love this short story for a lot of different reasons, but if you know Hemingway, you know his writing style. This is the epitome of Hemingway in a lot of ways. So as a background, Hemingway published this short story in 2007 during his time in Paris just before moving back to the US. He was an expat living in Europe, very disillusioned after World War I. And he lived a certain lifestyle that was very common at this time for the expats outside of America. It was the Bohemian Lifestyle. It was filled with an exploration of arts and culture and music, really expanding and experimenting with the boundaries of polite society, traditional society. Hemingway himself, had a very fair battle with a lot of different issues. When it came to multiple women or drinking or things like that, but he was also well known in the literary circles of the time, obviously at Gertrude Stein's salon. He was beloved and mentored and partnered with a lot of very famous writers who were all friends at the time. So there was kind of a shared culture amongst them. And this idea of an expat lifestyle in Europe post-war is something that you see at play in this text. So this really focuses on an American man and woman waiting at a train station in Spain. It's almost entirely dialogue, which is a very unique structure. It's also very typical of Hemingway, where what they're talking about isn't what they're really talking about, and you kind of have to read between the lines to understand. The subject matter, like I said, is purposely vague for a couple reasons. One of which is what they're talking about is not considered acceptable for talking about in society at this time. So the question is, as you read, were you able to figure out what they were discussing? So some of the themes that you see, some of the themes that you see here, there's a major issue at the heart of the dialogue, which is abortion. And again, at 1927, it's very impolite to discuss this subject in public. It's really not discussed in polite society at all. And the references to this idea of this operation are veiled because of that reason. But if you note, the tone of both speakers is really significant. The woman clearly does not want to have this operation. And the man is very subtly trying to encourage her to have one. You get the sense that they are just off in Europe having, many adventures, and this is something that is a bit of a burden to him, and to her, it's a very real issue. So the idea represents this larger crossroad in the relationship, quite literally. She never voices her true feelings, and instead she kind of gets frustrated with him and says, please stop talking, and ends the conversation without any kind of serious resolution. She says, there's nothing wrong with me, I feel fine. And where the relationship stands, where the issue of the abortion stands, is entirely unresolved because they won't address it directly. Oh, goodness. So sorry. So the setting is really quite important in this story. Not only are they culturally isolated, but they're in an area that's abandoned, it's rural, and this really represents the state of their relationship in and of itself. So it's emblematic of their relationship. They are Americans in a foreign land. Jig, the woman, doesn't speak any Spanish. She depends on him, the man, to communicate for her, which is kind of representative of her sort of state of being in this case, where she, is likely, it's 1927, she's likely not, there's a lot of issues at play in terms of financial independence, in terms of women's rights, who, just got the right to vote in America just a few years before. So she is unfortunately dependent upon him in this situation, and it's kind of reflected in the dialogue between them, where she's trying to assert her point of view while still kind of having him talk over her. So there is a literal crossroads, a literal railroad track that represents kind of the different ways that their relationship could go. And the heat, of course, is also contributing to the frustrated tone of this dialogue. So they're hot, they're lost, they're waiting on a train that hasn't come yet. She feels a little bit isolated. in truth, they're both Americans in a foreign land and they maybe don't quite fit in. So there's all these kind of feelings of discomfort happening on multiple levels. And that's contributing to the conflict that we're starting to see in the dialogue really from the get-go. And the backdrop of the hills is quite important because it's a key symbol that represents the tension of their relationship. So the conflict, of course, is key in any story, but here it's a man versus man and man versus self. So there's two different conflicts happening. The two characters are obviously opposed against each other across this concept of abortion, but it's also kind of representative of these larger societal constraints that are self-imposed, where we don't talk about these issues and we kind of sweep them under the rug. And in this case, at the time, Hemingway is really pointing out that these very serious issues like abortion are things that we don't talk about because they're considered impolite in society, but they're real things that need to be discussed because they have real impact on real lives. And this really, if you wanted to, you could kind of relate it further back to the idea of the World War I and the trauma that we experienced as a collective whole, and how people were very, very disillusioned with that with the experience of World War I, and people not really speaking the truth, governments not speaking the truth, not being open and honest about what was really happening. Goodness, I'm so sorry, guys. This is all out of order. And let me try to get this back in here. So one of the key symbols, and this is really the last thing I wanted to point out to you guys, one of the key symbols of the text is these hills, which are hills like white elephants, which represent this idea of not only the elephant in the room, but the pregnancy itself. And you see these symbols in the background throughout the text, and of course they represent this idea of the abortion. And so not only, like I said, are they crossroads at the railroad station, but it represents this crossroads in the relationship. And one more thing that I did want to point out was that it talks about kind of this foreign culture versus the American culture. And there are multiple references to the isolations the Americans feel in this culture. And like I said, notice that Jig doesn't speak Spanish, and she's even therefore further isolated than the man who is unnamed. And it's emblematic of their relationship issues as well. So I think that was the last point. Let me just double check and make sure. Yes, so that's kind of the key elements of Hills Like White Elephants. And like I said, this is really just a fascinating piece of characterization, a study in character. How Hemingway writes this is brilliant, and the dialogue, the back and forth, the unnamed issue. You may read it a second time. It's quite short, so if you read it a second time, really pay attention to kind of the social structures, the power structures, and the relationship structures between the two. And what do you think Hemingway is really trying to say about us as a society and our inability to address serious issues, or our inability to understand kind of how to resolve conflict? There's a lot of different takeaways you could have from Hills Like White Elephants. So make sure that you do kind of reread it again if you weren't sure what they were talking about the first round, because I think the more you read this piece of work, the more you sort of really fall in love with the structure and brilliance of it.